UK you are from. That would be really helpful. We are expecting about 100 people today, so we've opened up just a couple of minutes early to give us a chance to get people in. It's a big agenda item, so I'm sure there'll be lots of two-way conversation going on in the second part of the hour. So let me just see where we've got Debbie Bewley, Head of Sustainability and Environment for CPMS, based in London. David from Coventry University. Nick from AXA Insurance, based in London. Chris Koenig from Innovate UK. Well, I know Chris well. That's down from sunny Cornwall. Yes, indeed, Chris. I'm longing to get back down to Cornwall. Hayden Bennett's in from Salisbury, not far from where I live, only about half an hour. So welcome, everyone. People coming in already from all over the UK, which is great to see. We're getting more messages now. Margit Stocksted's in from Denmark, working for Sir Robert McAlpine. Rob Lamb, one of our regulars, is in from Nottingham. Tim Jones, Chairman of Southwest Business Council. Tim, another good friend of mine. Thank you for joining us. John Cross, yes, thank you. And there is a YouTube live stream link now gone into the chat box because some people prefer to join us on YouTube rather than on Zoom. So it's just after 12. I think what we will do is we will make a start, and as people come in, we will allow them to do so. But as I say, it's a big agenda item, so I think we do need to make a start. So a very good afternoon to you all. For those that don't know me, I'm Andrew Carpenter. I am Chief Executive of the Structural Timber Association, also Chief Executive of Constructing Excellence in the Southwest and the Midlands. And we are joined as co-hosts now by CE Yorkshire Humber, nationally, Northeast, the Midlands, from Wales, from the Northwest, and from London and the Southeast, as well as the CIOB in the Southwest. So we're a growing band of organisations now clubbing together to bring you what proves to be, from the feedback, these very worthwhile Friday afternoon sessions. I'm delighted to say that today we're probably tackling the globe's number one topic, the number one crisis, the climate change crisis, which I don't think many people now are denying. And as members of the built environment, we're responsible for about 40% of all emissions. So you can see why the focus of our attention within this sector has to be on the climate change crisis. And I'm delighted to say that Paul Brannan is with us today as our guest speaker. But before we go into that in more detail, what I'm going to ask now is Howard to take over and just take us through the house rules. Over to you, Howard.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and welcome to you all. I'm just going to run through things about Slido. I think a number of you probably are aware of Slido, but for those of you who are not, you can get into Slido by two ways. You can go to slido.com and use the code LM160421. For those of you who are very astute, that's today's date, or you can scan the code in. The way we're going to use Slido today is initially through a poll, but if you have questions and answers, please put your questions and answers into Slido. And if you think there is a good question there, you can even vote for it, which will accelerate it up the list of questions. We're also going to be using Slido at the end for a feedback survey, and we would appreciate your views on how you thought today went. So I think what we'll do now is we'll go straight into Slido. So just to remind you, slido.com, LM, and then today's date. So the first question, and already 6 people have completed. So let's have the first question up. Have you ever been to Scotland? Here's a fascinating question. Simple answer. So we give you time to put that in. The next question then, please, Abraham, you can complete this as we're going along. Have you heard of Alok Sharma? Another interesting question, a bit like general knowledge today. So 11 people, we're catching up. So it would be great if we could get up to 30 or 40 people. Let's keep going then with the next question. Do you think the majority, that is more than half of delegates, politicians, government officials, UN staff to the climate talks in Glasgow consider timber to be part of the solution to climate change? Simple yes and no answer. So let's have the next question then, please. If pressed, which do you think has the potential to store more carbon in the built environment? This is a very technical question. New build in wood or renovation stroke retrofit? Sure, there's some people in the room who have that answer. I don't think I do, but let's move on to the next one. Do you think delegates to the COP from all around the world realize homes can be made in factories? A simple yes and no answer. Now I'm going to leave you to answer those questions. So for those of you who haven't yet opened up or done it, please do so. And I'm now going to hand back to Andrew. And Andrew, you can take us further forward. Many thanks.
Okay, thank you, Howard. So just while we give you a minute or so to answer those questions, I think we've got 18 or so responses. It would be nice to get a few more. As I say, I'm delighted that Paul Brannan is able to join us today as our guest speaker. Paul is an ex-MEP from the Northeast and had responsibility in that capacity in the sectors of agriculture and environment. So when he left office, for obvious reasons, it became apparent that he was the obvious choice to become Director of Public Affairs for sawmillers and the woodworking industries across Europe, which is the position he now holds. And I have the pleasure of sitting on Paul's committee in terms of dealing with COP26, in terms of the European Advisory Committee when it comes to the timber sector, timber industry sector. So I've been working alongside Paul now for a few months as we move towards COP26, which hopefully will go ahead, Paul, but we're not quite sure yet. But I know that. Now, just before I introduce you into the fray, so to speak, could we have the results up? So this will give Paul a flavour for the audience in terms of what you think. So if we could put those results up, do you think, please, Abraham, would be helpful? Thank you very much. So do you think delegates to, is that the first question? There we go. There's the first question. So have you ever been to Scotland? What are the results then, Abraham? Ah, there we go. Most people have, Paul, you'll be pleased to know. 91% have. So that's good. And the next question? So have you heard of Alok Sharma? Not quite so many, 59%. That question will become apparent when Paul starts speaking, because Alok Sharma is going to become a household name, I would suggest, by the end of the year. What's the next question, please? Do you think the majority, etc., consider timber part of the solution? About 61% say yes and 39% say no. So that's going to be part of our job, Paul, I think, when we're at COP26 to overcome the 39%. Next question, please. If pressed, which do you think has the potential to store more carbon? So new build is saying 54%, renovation and retrofit 46%. So about 50-50 there. I'm sure Paul will come up with a definitive answer for that. He wouldn't have asked it otherwise. Next question. Do you think delegates to COP from all around the world realize homes can be made in factories? Again, pretty even Steven there, 53-47. That's an interestingly low figure, actually, from my point of view. And I think there's one more question.
That's it.
That's it, is it? I've got it wrong. Okay, well, if you could lose the survey then, Abraham. Thank you very much. Paul, it now gives me great delight to ask you if you would now address our audience, which is up around the 60 mark already. So over to you, sir.
Okay, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm speaking to you from Newcastle upon Tyne in the northeast of England. So I'm nearer to Glasgow than I am to London. And I'm going to talk you through our sort of approach, primarily at a kind of European level, to the climate change talks in Glasgow. But it's going to be wider than that. It's more of a global presence, hopefully. And we're in a situation where I think it's fair to say the focus, and perfectly understandably, most recently has been on the terrible COVID situation, and many countries are still in a situation where the worst is yet to come. The question of how big a recession follows it remains a moot point. But the big issue hasn't gone away, and that's the issue of climate change. But it's been lost, I think, somewhat from a focus point of view, certainly in the media in recent months for obvious reasons. And at a UK level, as we come out of COVID, hopefully in the next few months, then I think we'll see more talk about climate change, primarily because the UK are hosting the climate change talks in Glasgow in November. And there was an item on the Today programme at around about 8:15 this morning, which shows that it's starting to creep back up the agenda. And the talks themselves have been delayed a full year. This was meant to have happened in November of last year, and due to COVID was put back a full year. While the British government publicly are saying the talks will be going ahead in November, I think it remains the case that there's a possibility that they don't. And the reason for that remains COVID. And you can see the situation in India deteriorating, the situation in Brazil deteriorating. And for certainly some of the big global South countries who are incredibly important to have at the COP, if they were to say to the UN, we're not able to bring our full delegations because of the COVID situation, then you could see a situation where the British government, along with the UN, reluctantly may decide to either move it back 6 months or a year yet again. But at the moment, and this was repeated on the Today programme this morning, the British government intend for the talks to go ahead in November. And these are the biggest climate change talks since 6 years ago in Paris. And Paris was widely seen as a success, in inverted commas, certainly kept things on track. And this is our next big round of conference talks. And that question I asked is about, have you heard of Alok Sharma? He was until relatively recently a leading figure in the cabinet, but was then asked by the Prime Minister to take over as the president of the talks. So the UK are hosting, and Alok Sharma is the president of the talks. And I think Andrew's right, by Christmas, he will become pretty much a household name if the talks go ahead. He continues to sit in the cabinet. He's increasingly well networked across the world. The UK diplomatic operation, all our embassies across the world behind the scenes are working at a country level with individual countries on what will be their contribution to the talk, as we try and lift the ambition that of the conference, hopefully delivering. These are, if you like, the big players. Special piece of software that I've got my hands on, where you can place a photograph of a politician into PowerPoint, and it will automatically adjust the size of the photograph in relation to the importance of the politician. Just in case anyone believed me there, I've just made that up actually. But the Chinese are the key players in this, and second the US, third the EU, and while the UK is the host, our influence in all of this is considerably smaller than the other three key major players. And as we know, as you've probably heard on the news, John Kerry is out in China at the moment, having discussions. And there's also discussions underway between the Chinese and the French and Germans by telephone today, as we begin, or as we continue the process of counting down to the talks in Glasgow and having these bilateral conversations as the parties try and raise each other's level of ambition and commitment. So very much an ongoing process at the moment. It did occur to me when I was putting together this particular slide as to how many socialists can you see in this slide? 4 politicians. It did strike me that if you were a Republican, you can probably see 3 socialists here, and that if you were a hardline Trump supporter, you can probably see 4 socialists in this picture. Just a thought. I had the privilege to be part of the EU delegation to the Paris climate change talks in 2015, 6 years ago. There was around about 15 members of the European Parliament who made up the Parliament's delegation to the talks, working alongside the Commission's, European Commission's delegation to the talks. And an extraordinary event held on an old airfield in the north outskirts of Paris. And the best way of describing one of these big climate change talks, I think the word that springs to mind is it's a jamboree, and it's a cross between a party political conference and a trade fair. Very large numbers of people, delegates from literally pretty much every country in the world in attendance. So large amount of room needed. Media from all over the world, and then outside the event, immediately outside in the city, big NGO, non-governmental, civil society presence, demonstrations, protests going on, and then sort of packed, tight moments of diplomacy going on, talks in sideline in the corridors, etc. And then hopefully, as is the case, has happened in France, a kind of breakthrough at the end. Very common for these events to continue maybe 1 or 2 days longer than intended, if there's the possibility of getting to some kind of conclusion. And if we are in that kind of territory where a breakthrough, success is possible, then it's not surprising to see world leaders flying in to join their delegation in that last 48, 2-3 day period. So will Joe Biden arrive into Glasgow at the last minute? Could we expect to see the president of the commission arriving, etc.? So we'll see how it unfolds. The physicality of Glasgow is interesting and different from Paris. In Paris, as I said, we were on the outskirts for the event. In the case of Glasgow, it's walking distance to the city centre. So a lot of you have been to Scotland, so some of you may well be familiar with Glasgow, the River Clyde running through the city, middle of the city, and the conference site straddles the river. The blue zone is the zone that's hardest to get into. You do have to have a pass, and that's for the journalists who've got permission, for the delegates, for the UN officials, etc., the politicians. And then the second tier is the green zone, which you still need to have documentation to get into, but you'll have NGOs represented there, business represented there. And as I'll discuss later, that's where we hope to be. As it happens, this is right next to the BBC's headquarters in Glasgow. And there's a part of the site to the bottom left of this aerial picture, which will be opened up it's under the control of Glasgow City Council, and you can make a pitch to have a kind of presence there as well. So all sorts of things will be going on, but it is a very tight and constrained site compared to previous, particularly to Paris. That's a view from the city centre. This is the walking distance. You could get off at the main railway station, having maybe arrived on the overnight sleeper from London if you chose to come that way. And those two curved buildings towards the top right of the picture, those are the two main venues with linked by a pedestrian bridge, so walking distance from the city centre. Now, our presence at the conference, which will be, if you like, the Europeans leading a global, particularly northern wood presence, and I'll come back at the end to who's more directly involved. We want to communicate to the people who are at the conference what is now possible to do from a construction point of view with wood. There'll be many people there who realize that traditionally, historically, 1- and 2-story buildings, particularly family homes in Canada, the United States, Scandinavia, Scotland, many places in Europe have been built from timber. No surprise there. But what's new, as well you know, is that it's now possible to build tall and big in engineered timber. So the material of engineered timber is something we want to convey at the event. And we will be pointing out to people that the Canadians have done 18 stories in Vancouver, in London, in Hackney, at Dalston Lane. We've got the largest amount of cross-laminated timber in a building in the world. The Norwegians, through a bit of clever design on top of a building, have built the tallest wooden building in the world, which, while has the same number of stories as the Vancouver building, is taller, and is even taller than the Ho-Ho building in Austria, in Vienna, which is going to come in at its highest point at 24 stories. The actual Norwegian 18-story building will remain higher, but this ability to build at height and in scale we want to convey. And the beauty of it, often, this building at the bottom in the middle, new culture center in one of the cities in Sweden, and bottom right, an extension to the Bundestag Parliament in Berlin, which is going to be made from engineered timber. Probably nearest to Glasgow, of the building that kind of illustrates what is now possible with engineered timber is the Viahag timber construction distillery, with the extraordinary, amazing roof, both inside and out, mimicking the hills behind. That's the kind of thing that's possible. That's part of what we want to convey. And we also want to convey that it's possible, as well you know, to make prefabricated housing in an indoor setting with all the advantages that go with that. If you want to do, you could have three 8-hour shifts in a day. Weather doesn't affect the situation. One of the things I noticed when I was traveling, looking at prefabricated construction off-site in Scandinavia, in the top right picture here, maybe not that clear, but the electrician at work there is a woman. As we know, building sites across Europe, particularly in the UK, it's very unusual to see a woman working on a construction site in the UK, alas. Much more common, though, to see women working in factory settings, say car production, where this prefabricated way of making houses is much more like a car factory than a building site. And that might be going out to site either as a bottom left, as the units already in place, or maybe going out bottom in the middle in panels to site to make the kind of thing that we know Urban Splash have erected, in this case, not far from me in North Shields on Tyneside. Now, the new build is all very exciting, but there's also renovation to think about, and renovation using wood products is something certainly at a European level, which is important. The European Union last year launched a renovation wave with the aim to upgrade to a much higher energy efficiency standard 75% of the current building stock in Europe by 2050. And 2050 is the target date for the EU to become the first carbon neutral continent. And we can use wood-based materials, particularly in relation to lagging lofts, but there's also floors and doors. And this was an interesting picture, bottom right, which I just picked up this week at attending a conference to do with wood construction in the Baltics. And here in Estonia, we see Soviet-era buildings having an extra skin put on them, made from prefabricated wooden sections, to greatly increase their ability to insulate against the cold, but they are wood-based, wood-framed. And while that may be Soviet era design architecture, let's face it, there's plenty of stuff all over Western Europe and including in the UK like that. So part of what we want to convey is that it's not just about the new build, it's also about the renovation. And there's other benefits as well. And I think this is maybe one of the benefits that we would do well to communicate at Glasgow to people attending in relation to air pollution. The sad answer is that Ella was killed by London's air pollution. She suffered from asthma, and the coroner did find that it had been the primary contribution to her untimely death. And while we're coming at this primarily from the point of view of climate, when it comes to our big cities across the whole of the world, air quality is also a very important issue. And we know that building in wood means you're dealing with a much lighter material than if you're building with steel and concrete. And we have various pieces of work which show that the number of deliveries to a construction site, if wood is the primary product as opposed to steel or concrete, can be up to 8-9 times fewer deliveries. Now, these are heavy goods vehicles bringing the material to site. So 8 to 9 times fewer lorries arriving on a construction site means two big things. One, less emissions in the form of the pollutants, which is primarily the very small pieces of rubber that break off from the heavy goods vehicles' tires into the atmosphere, contributing to the air, significantly contribution to the air pollution. So we reduce those considerably by using wood as a lighter material, but also the actual carbon emissions from burning of the fossil fuels, whether it's the petrol or the diesel. So two big wins there by working in wood on construction sites as a result. That's something I think we need to get across as well. And then because this is a global conference and it's UN inspired, I think one of the other issues we want to be talking about is the growing world population. This is a picture from Egypt, where the population is set to increase considerably by at least another third. I think there are around about 100 million at the moment. And in 30 years' time, they'll have a population of 150 million. And it does beg the question as to where are they going to live? And if we use the traditional building methods of the last 100 years, focused primarily on concrete and steel, then we'll drive a coach and horses through our climate change aspirations. And you can scale this up. You look at India, which has got a similar projection of population growth, increased urbanization there and around the world. Population's becoming denser. What's the material we're going to use to build with? And we need to convey this to the delegates, the politicians, those attending Glasgow, is that the only material that we know of at the moment which can substitute for steel and concrete in building at height and at scale, and thereby reducing emissions, is wood. And just to go back to this renovate and build, I think it depends on who you talk to, is that the new build is where, if you like, the excitement is, and understandably, lagging lofts is seen as a rather dull enterprise in comparison. And we've certainly been kicking around at a European level a discussion which is about which has the potential to store more carbon, which is why I placed it in the questions. Now, although Andrew said I was maybe going to give you the answer, I can't give you the answer because we still don't know. And it's clearly an area, and this could be good to discuss under questions, it's clear an area where we need to do more work. So when the European Union produced its renovation wave paper in October of last year, it certainly made reference to the fact that there is the possibility when we come to renovating homes across Europe and beyond, we can use wood-based products, and as a consequence, we will store carbon in the built environment. So they acknowledge that, but they didn't make any attempt to give any idea of the scale of that. And we have got an idea as to what the potential of new build is to store carbon, but what we don't know is whether the renovation wave is smaller or bigger. And the simple answer is almost certainly going to be, well, it depends which you do most of. And the interesting question will be, well, what if we do a lot of both? So what if we do a lot of building in wood, and what if we do a lot of renovation with wood-based products? What could the collective total of carbon stored be going forwards? And I guess somehow we need to convey this at Glasgow, which is that wood and timber and forestry in the round collectively have the potential to make a quite significant delivery in relation to reaching climate change targets. And you do that by adding up the following. So, and politicians and others probably have a fairly good idea that carbon is sequestered in the world's forests, probably a fairly high understanding of that. Maybe a less of a realization that there is already a very large amount of carbon stored in the built environment historically, been there for 50, 100, 200, 300, 400 years, and is still there. That adds up. There's the potential to store through new build in wood, and there's the potential to store in renovation through wood-based products. And all of the time we're substituting for other materials which would have been more carbon intensive. So that goes into the equation. And we mustn't, and there is a tendency to do this, to forget about the potential to store in wooden furniture, whether it's wooden furniture that's been around historically or the wooden furniture that we're yet to build. And you add that all up and you begin to get a sense of what is wood's potential contribution, forestry's potential contribution in the round to tackling climate change, and we need to get that across. It's certainly understood at the highest level in the European Union. We were both surprised and delighted in equal measure when, in her first address to the European Parliament, the relatively new then President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen from Germany, said in her speech, "We know that the construction sector can be turned from a carbon source into a carbon sink if organic building materials like wood are applied." Now, we know that she was primarily thinking about new builds, and part of our work at the European level is to get those around her and the President herself to realize that renovation has probably equal potential. Now, back to focusing in specifically on Glasgow. At the COP, what we hope to do is as follows. The timber and forest sector has a key role to play in the transition towards a greener and more sustainable economy, mainly through the abatement of greenhouse gas emissions. And the sector could play a still more significant role if governments and others seize the opportunity to decarbonize construction by using wood-based products for green construction, renovation and furniture wherever appropriate and possible. I think the appropriate and possible is important. You know, we realize that concrete has a fantastic role in providing the foundations for our wonderful wooden buildings. We need steel joints, etc. It's where appropriate, and hybrid buildings are absolutely fine as far as we're concerned. And our objective in being there is to communicate the significant role our sector can play in tackling climate change. And we'll call for governments to have a long-term vision that enables a real shift towards a green economy via the use of wood in mitigating climate change. And we've assembled a team. So there's a small steering group to organize this work, which I chair, but we've got Wood for Good and Confor and TTF. And then to make sure we've got a bit of an international presence, we've got colleagues from the US and from Canada. And the Italians are also involved because the Italians are the co-hosts along with the UK of the COP. And then we've got a wider partners advisory group, which Andrew sits on, and that draws in expertise from further and further afield, which helps advise us as the core group. And we're open to this group being extended as we head towards the COP. So if there's anyone listening who feels that their organization could make a contribution, then we'd be pleased to hear from them. And just to finish, we're hoping to have, sorry, wrong slide. We're hoping to have a pavilion at the event, and we're in touch with a major architect who you will probably all have heard of, but this isn't public yet. And they're up to the challenge of designing a pavilion, which would almost certainly be outside because the inside space is too limited in Glasgow. I hasten to add, this isn't it. This is just to give you an idea of a wooden pavilion, is that we have something specially constructed for the COP in Glasgow, which can act as a visual representation of the wonders of engineered timber in particular, but would also have within it some examples of renovation products, but very much focusing on the engineered timbers, the ability to build at height and at scale. And it wouldn't say just be glulam or just be CLT. The challenge to the architect will be to incorporate a mixture of engineered timbers in the structure. It's going to need to be waterproof if it's outside. It needs to be intriguing and inviting to encourage people to come in. And once they're inside, we'll be able to almost grab a hold of them and talk them through the wonders of wood. And it's a place where we could hold receptions and talks and events. And it could be the case that one evening, the Finnish government hold a reception where they're showcasing and talking about products that come from Finland. We could have the Canadians doing a lunchtime event, etc., etc. And we'll layer it up and build a very interesting program over the 2 weeks of the conference, where we hope to encourage many different countries' delegations to come through, to get politicians to visit, etc., and to allow them to see, touch, feel, smell the product that we're working with and the product that we think's got so much to offer in relation to tackling climate change. As I say, this isn't it, so don't think that this is the design, but it's just to give you an idea of the way in which we want to kind of convey that this is a material which goes way beyond what many people have historically associated with building in wood, which is the 1 or 2 story timber framed house. It is now possible to do quite amazing things with wood. The prefabrication allows affordability to be built into the system. So we aren't talking here about beautiful, sustainable buildings which are beyond the reach financially of the masses, so to speak. Is that particularly through offsite construction, we can tick all 3 boxes, which happen to be the 3 boxes that the European Bauhaus movement launched just recently by Ursula von der Leyen herself are talking about, which is sustainability, we tick that box, affordability, we can tick that box, and beauty, we can tick that box as well. So hopefully that's given you a feel of what it is that we hope to achieve in Glasgow, and would be very happy to take part in questions and discussions now.
Paul, thank you very much. A lot of information to take in, and I'm sure the audience has been delighted with what you've been able to pass on, because there is obviously an increasing amount of interest in COP26, and quite understandably. Now the questions are beginning to come in. We have had a couple actually placed in the chat box. So I wonder if I could ask David Savage and Hilary to transfer your questions from the chat box to Slido. That would be a great help because we can see them better in Slido, and Abraham can bring them up on the screen. So if you'd like to stop sharing your screen, Paul, that's great. Let's go straight into the questions. We could have them one by one, Abraham, perhaps, so they're easier for Paul and I to see. But the first one is, what are the challenges for construction industry from emerging retrofit, 27 million UK homes, and reuse buildings, e.g. AJ campaign, rather than new build agendas? That's a question from Mark Southgate.
I'm just processing to see if I understand the question. So the challenges. Well, I think, I mean, again, it does depend on who you talk to and where you're coming from. This on is that I sense an excitement around the potential to build new in wood, and we can see that in part. We put up these beautiful pictures, etc., and people are genuinely surprised to discover how tall and how big you can build with wood, and it's a very good way into a conversation. But when you juxtapose that with the discussion around lagging lofts, it becomes frightfully dull in comparison. And part of the problem with a lot of renovation, retrofitting work is it's, to all intents and purposes, invisible, or can be. So you could retrofit a whole Victorian street of terraces, make them much more energy efficient, which ticks all sorts of boxes, beginning with we are producing less emissions from these houses in relation to climate change, because the majority of them were using fossil fuels to heat the homes, particularly in the winters. So ticking a big box there. The people who live in those homes, especially if they were on low incomes, were spending a disproportionate and unnecessary large amount of their income on heating their homes. They're now better off. Ticking a big box there. That's really useful for politicians to deliver on more money in your pocket as a result. And the kind of list goes on. But as I say, it can be somewhat invisible. And I think part of the trick here is going to be to come up with ways in which we can, as visually, communicate the benefits of renovation and retrofitting as we can with new build. And kind of open to suggestions as to how we do that. But it does seem to me that it's in many ways is a communications challenge as much as it is anything else.
Yeah, I mean, we've got within Constructing Excellence Southwest, we've got one of the leading players, MySpace, in terms of retrofit, and they've got a solution with a sort of a SIPS overcoat. And one of their directors, AJ Eaton, did a presentation for me a couple of years ago at a housing summit, and he was saying that for us to meet the existing stock, we'd have to retrofit a house every 1.5 minutes or something like that. And I don't know about you, Paul, but I would think that's probably going to be the biggest challenge in terms of resource, both cost and people to do it.
Yeah. And I think the part of the trick here is challenge is where there's a challenge, there's also an opportunity.
Of course.
And I think that not necessarily the people who are, if you like, on the call, so to speak, but the wider population may, well, and particularly decision makers in the context of Glasgow, may well not have realised just how big the potential of the renovation wave is to, one, reduce carbon emissions, and two, to store carbon. And especially that second factor, to store carbon, is certainly in my experience of contact with politicians at a European level, at the European Parliament, is that the renovation wave is first and foremost about reducing emissions as a result of reducing energy use, and is secondly about saving people money, particularly in people on low incomes. And it hasn't really registered, despite the fact that it is in the Commission's document itself, as the fact that it can add carbon to the built environment as a store. And I think why we're maybe falling short there is because the Commission and no one else to date has quantified what that potential is. So yes, you've lagged your off with wood fibre, you've created yourself a small carbon store, that's great, that's a plus. What happens if 37 million homes across Europe in the first wave of the renovation movement, which is over the next 10 years, were to have their lofts lagged with wood fibre? How much carbon does that store? And no one has yet to do that kind of work, which then gives us some sense of what it is, how big the target is that we're potentially aiming at. And I think the more we can convey the potential of the renovation wave to store carbon, on a similar scale as the potential of new build to store carbon, then we won't create, if you like, the excitement around renovation that clearly exists around new build.
And of course, the other thing, Paul, is what an opportunity to stimulate the economy from your first slide coming out of COVID with the recession. What a way the government could actually kill two birds with one stone, couldn't they? Anyway, let's move on with the next question because they're coming in thick and fast now. And we've only got about 15 minutes. So the elephant in the room, which nobody seems to be addressing, is that insurers and legislators are steering designers away from the use of combustible materials. That person is anonymous, but what's your view on that, Paul?
Well, clearly there's some truth in this. The Baltic conference that I attended earlier this week also showed it up quite. I won't name the individual Baltic country, but obviously there's only three. Is that they're making they have a very successful industry in exporting prefabricated wooden homes. And those prefabricated wooden homes wouldn't be allowed to be built in the country from which they are originating because the fire regulations in that country wouldn't allow that to happen. So you've got this kind of extraordinary situation. Scandinavia for a long time has been similar in that this is the home of wood as we know it at a European level. They export a huge amount of wood, and yet you go around the city centre in Helsinki and you can't see anything made out of wood. And that goes back to fire regulations. And I guess the fire regulations are as relevant and as problematic potentially for renovation as they are for new build. And this is why, if you like, winning the argument, and it has to be based on technical proof. And it was great to hear, because we were talking just before the meeting began, Andrew, about fire tests going on engineered timber. That work needs to be done at a country level, at a European level, at a global level, so that we can convince people, that the authorities in particular, the fire authorities, that it is perfectly possible to produce materials, both for new build and for renovation, that are wood-based, that are safe in the sense that they are as safe as any other material that could be used.
So I think from an STA point of view, if I could just put my 3 pennyworth in terms of what I call traditional timber frame, 1 and 2 story homes and so on, there's absolutely no issue at all with insurance. It's used and extensively, and the amount of timber frame homes is on the increase. People like Barrett's have now bought one of our members, Oregon. Countryside have bought West Frame. Persimmon already owns Space 4, so there's no issue with, if you like, bog standard house building. Where there is a bit of a concern is around mass timber and CLT, and that's where the STA this year is spending $500,000 on some fire testing, which is what Paul alluded to. And we're also part of something called the Timber Accelerator Hub, which is a specific program where we are working with insurers. A lot of it's around education. And as you quite rightly say, Paul, what we need to get across is the science and the facts and the evidence. And we're working towards that, but we do acknowledge that there are certain pockets that we still need to address. So thank you for that very relevant question. If we could have the next one, please. Again, one at a time would be good. Okay, how do you think we should get some countries like Brazil to stop destroying forests by incentives? Who pays the developed world? Sorry, who pays the developed world? I should have gone up at the end.
A very good question, and it's such a problematic area. The simple answer is yes, the developed world should pay the global south in relation to historic carbon emissions. I used to work for Christian Aid, the development agency, before I was a member of the European Parliament. Christian Aid was the first of the UK development agencies to work on climate change. And Christian Aid continues to do that and is part of the civil society coalition in the UK working on climate change along with the environmental groups. It came up on the Today programme. Those of you who may have heard it this morning, the issue of Brazil. And we do have to bear in mind that beginning in the UK and then spreading across Europe and North America, is we were the forefront of the industrial revolution. There's a very strong argument for saying that climate change began on Tyneside, where I'm speaking to you from, with the coal industry and everything that then flowed from that. So whereas China is now the world's biggest emitter, it's only been emitting for a relatively short period of time compared to the advanced industries like ourselves. So we've got this historic legacy of carbon emissions, which we need to be honest about and factor in, that we've built our wealth on it. And while not necessarily singling out Brazil, but more the case for the developing world in general, the global south, they are very much Johnny come lately to the business of carbon emissions. And we do have to factor that in. It makes it a kind of three-dimensional puzzle rather than a two-dimensional puzzle as we head towards Glasgow. And it's always been the case that the countries of the global south, countries like Brazil, have said the approach you're taking is potentially unfair because it doesn't factor in historical carbon emissions. And maybe the only way we can deal with it is by a financial flow of resources from the north to the south to incentivize and to make sure that countries like Brazil in particular don't destroy their forest.
Right, we've got about 10 questions left, Paul, and we've got 10 minutes. So we're going to do some quick fire answers now, if you don't mind. So question here, in terms of offsite manufactured products, how much of this is UK grown timber?
Virtually none.
Thank you. Next question. That's how I like it. Interested in your comment that offsite prefabrication is affordable. My experience, says Mark, with modular construction was very expensive by comparison to traditional build. Do you mind if I just make a quick point there, Paul, before you
No,
comment?
please do.
The Ryder Levitt Bucknell, who are very respected QSs, did a report which the STA was very pleased to use about 2 or 3 years ago in the world of affordable homes, and they actually found that timber frame construction was about 1% cheaper, less expensive than masonry build. And if you then added the fact it was about 20% quicker to complete, there was some significant other money savings in the process. So that's some facts that we use within the STA, as I say, using this RLB document. So if you go looking for that, Mark, that might be of interest. But Paul, hopefully that's given you time now to think about your response.
So maybe I should have caveated it slightly more. Over time, it's likely to become relatively cheaper. So I think there's a time issue here where some of these big operations are only just beginning to get underway, prefabrication at scale. So there'll be a cost saving there. And then I think the other thing is to see it in its, and this is important from a climate point of view, is to look at it in its fullest sense. When we talk about cost, it's cost of what and the cost to whom. So the cost of delivering very large amounts of heavy material to site is one of the costs is air pollution, and one of the costs is increased emissions. Who pays that cost? Well, actually, it isn't paid for as part of the cost of the building, but it still is a cost to society in general. So somehow we've got to get into a situation, and the Finnish government are probably leading on this, is that whole life cycle assessment in the biggest, broadest sense. So what do you mean by the cost of the building? And just to pick up on Andrew's point about how things can be cheaper, but maybe it's difficult to see that they're cheaper, is one of the biggest costs on a construction site is the hire of the large crane or several cranes that sit on the site for the period of the build. If your build is 25% faster because you're using prefabricated wooden materials, then that means the cost of your crane is 25% cheaper because it's there 25% less of the time. So where's the saving of that? Make sure you factor that in as well.
Agreed. I'll have the next question up, if I may, please, Abraham. What is the balance between leaving carbon sequestered in the forest, A, on your slide, and the storage options C to F? Increasing C to F could reduce A.
Great question. And with my third-class degree in theology, I am not well qualified to answer it. But there are people out there who made a living doing PhDs on this kind of thing. It's incredibly complicated. I think that some of the simple things to bear in mind, but it then does become very complicated, is if you leave a forest to grow and to grow and to grow and to grow, it gets to a point where it starts to decline. So if we're talking about a traditional conifer forest, yes, the trees will grow 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, but then at some point they start to stop growing, they stop sequestering carbon, and they start to slowly release the carbon. So the idea of leaving forests permanently, certainly forests that have been planted as commercial forests, isn't practical from the point of view of continuing to store carbon. And the work that people like Professor Schnellenhuber have been doing recently at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Research, and he's the key thinker behind Ursula von der Leyen as the Commission's president, talking about the built environment as a carbon sink. They're talking about reforesting, increasing forest cover, but having a kind of continual shift of appropriate sustainable timber out of the forest and storing it, if you like, in the built environment, and then backfilling and replacing that with new planting. And obviously in the first 5 years, those new plants don't sequester much carbon, but once they move into 10, 15, 20 years, they start to sequester. And just to put in a word of support for the much maligned Sitka spruce, certainly at a UK level, this is the tree that sequesters carbon faster than any other tree that can be grown in the UK and in the Northern Hemisphere. So that ability was much talk of carbon capture and sequestration, CCS, huge expense to do it technically. Actually, we've got right under our noses the tree, which will do it for us at scale and at speed. And I think that idea of growing it in the forest and then at the appropriate point moving it into the built environment and then planting again and then moving it again is a way of building up a collective carbon store, which is both in the forest and in the built environment, which together is what we need.
Thank you, Paul. We've got 8 questions now to do in 4 minutes. So it's going to be really quick fire, Paul, if you don't mind. Are there any green environmental type issues surrounding glues, resins, varnishes, etc. being used in the process?
Yes, there are. There are inappropriate and out-of-date varnishes, resins and glues which could be used. And increasingly there's a shift and it needs to be speeded up towards using environmentally friendly options.
Thank you. Next question, please, Abraham. We are often asked if more and more new buildings are built with timber, does that not mean that there will be increasing pressure on the world's forests?
Good question. It all has to be done within the sustainability limits. So my knowledge is primarily at a European level. So most European countries that grow timber are operating, when it comes to the use of that timber, at below their annual increment. So the annual increment is the amount by which, if you were to cut more, you would be reducing the carbon stock. And as long as you stay within it, then that's fine. So so a country like Sweden is pretty close to making maximum use of its annual increment, but most of the European countries fall short. So there is a gap there which we can work into. I think another interesting area is more trees on farms to produce more wood fiber, which can go into many of the renovation materials. Rather than the sawn timber, which needs to be prioritized from the forest into the new build.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on if you don't mind, because we need to whip through these questions. Bamboo is particularly promising in tropical and subtropical countries. Would CEI Bois want to invite bamboo representatives?
This is absolutely correct. Bamboo can do maybe for the global south what traditional sawn timber could do for the global north when it comes to construction. Huge potential for bamboo. It grows incredibly quickly, absorbing carbon quickly, etc. I would have to go back and consult the steering group as to whether that was the case. But I wouldn't rule it out, but I wouldn't want to say yes just off the top of my head on this call.
So if we could have David's contact details in the chat box, perhaps we can make sure we pass those on. Next question, please. What will be the challenges in terms of MDF particle board use on the scale envisaged, considering importing issues around green shipping, etc.?
It's a heavy material, and takes up quite a bit of space. So producing it and then transporting it long distances, there's a question mark against that. Ideally, you would want to transport it over short distances. And I think, therefore, part of the answer here is that within sensible approach is all European countries should be looking to having enough of a forest stock to be able to produce these kind of materials. And this would be a good challenge for the UK, is that doubling UK forest cover is something there's a lot of support for. One of the reasons we need to do it is to produce the wood fiber within the UK to produce our own particle board materials and not be importing them over relatively long distances from Scandinavia, for instance.
Thank you. Next question, Abraham. Whilst appreciating the international aspect of COP, the pavilion sounds like an ideal opportunity to showcase the suitability of homegrown timber products. So says Sam.
I think we would want to do that, to say, I think part of what we've been trying to counter at a UK level is this argument that UK timber is not suitable to make engineered timber with products with. I think we want to be able to rebut that in some shape or form at the COP. So it could be that if we've got 10 structural units involved, that one of them is a piece of CLT, and I know it exists because I've seen it, I've touched it, I've sat on it, of CLT made from UK beech, which was tested at Napier University. If we could have one of those panels incorporated into the design of the pavilion, then we would be able to rebut that with a physical presence of a UK-made CLT, in this case, a hardwood.
Thank you. Now, the next one I can see is a statement rather than a question. So Rob says, we've been using advanced timber panels for retrofit of existing homes in Nottingham. And there's a link to a video. And the last one, please. Is there a list of UK organisations that provide housing, developing affordable homes in the Northeast and considering design construction of new homes utilising MMC? Well, certainly, Alan, from an STA point of view, we could put you in touch with our MMC providers in structural timber. I don't know whether, Paul, you want to expand on that?
And just recently has been launched in the northeast of England, the first climate coalition. So it's the Northeast of England Climate Coalition, NECO. It's got a website. And it's the first time that the private sector, the public sector, and the voluntary sector have come together at a regional level in England to have a climate campaign. And one of their themes of work, I know this because I was involved in helping to set it up, is around the built environment, both to do with renovation and retrofitting, but also new build. And I would suggest you start by looking at the website, and that should give you a way in from a northeast angle.
And I know my colleague Kat Lingwood, who's my opposite number in the Northeast Regional Director, is also involved in that. So it's just after 1. We're going to bring it to a close. If you'd like a CPD certificate for today, please go on to www.mypropass.co.uk, and the code you'll need today is CE-466. CE-466. If you go there, you can pick up a CPD certificate. Also, we now have issued in the chat box a link to a survey. As you know, those regular attendees will know that each week we ask you to just give us a bit of feedback, which helps us plan future Friday webinars. So if you could go to the feedback survey at slido.com, and that would be really helpful. All it leaves me now to do is, first of all, to thank, as always, Howard and Abraham for so ably hosting our weekly webinar, but most importantly, Paul, to you for giving up your valuable time to join us, and also an immense amount of knowledge and information, which, judging from the questions you will see, has provoked a lot of interest from our attendees. And to everyone else, I wish you a very good afternoon, and I think the weather forecast is good. So a very pleasant weekend, and I'll see you all at COP26. Bye-bye now.